All right, welcome everyone to another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every week of the academic year in this room at this time. And we have actually just one more talk after this for this quarter. The speakers for winter quarter are all already up on the website at bec.ucla.edu, so you can have a look at those. Please also sign the sign-in sheet that's going around that helps us keep track of how many people are here for our funders and other people. So the last talk for this quarter is by Amy Parrish, who's coming from USC, and her title is Reflections on Our Closest Living Relatives and Ourselves, Lessons from the Bonobo Sisterhood. So please join us for that. This week I'm pleased to introduce Tom Morgan, who's coming from Arizona State University, and he's going to be talking about human gene culture and culture coevolution.
Hey guys. Thanks Brooke for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming along. I hope you're nicely rested from the 4-day weekend, recovered from any food comas. Okay, an earlier version of this talk that I gave in the summer was more kind of like high-level, big-picture-y stuff, but you guys, being the lucky people you are, get the kind of the more in-depth, nitty-gritty one that I've been putting together since then. So it's going to be kind of intense, but hopefully it'll be fun. Anyway, so fitness relies on making good decisions, as embodied by this character in the middle, and good decisions require combining information. And the two kinds that I'm interested in with regards to this talk are, on the one hand, this sort of like symbolized by this kind of data collection thing. So I'm going to use that to mean asocial information, so information that you yourself collect about the world. And on the other hand, we've got the opinions and decisions of other individuals. So that's social information. And so if we want to maximize our fitness, then we need to use these two sources of information effectively. But so why might we copy others at all? So one is that other individuals potentially offer higher quality information than we have ourselves. Social information is generally also assumed to be cheap. So the idea is that, say you've come across a new food source, it's a mushroom. Is it good to eat? Is it not good to eat? Well, to find this out for yourself is kind of expensive, quite risky. You know, you eat it and you just see what happens. You might die. However, in this case, social information is generally pretty cheap. You can just look around, see what other people are doing. If no one's eating it, or if people are eating it and dying, then it's probably bad. But if everyone's eating it and having a great time, then it's probably good. But it has downsides too. So one is that there's actually a potential for really low quality information. And there's also risks of deceit and miscommunication. And finally, and something that's going to crop up a lot in this talk, is the risk that information may be out of date. So if you're choosing to copy someone else instead of collecting new information yourself, then there's always a risk that the relevant aspect of the environment has changed since that information was originally collected. So rather than collecting new information today, let's say I instead ask Brooke for advice, and Brooke tells me what she knows, but she collected that information maybe 6 months ago. So there's a risk that that information may no longer be as relevant as it once was. And this was a question addressed in the late 80s by Alan Rogers, and the result of a model he created was basically to show that social learning can struggle in an environment that changes frequently. And this figure basically shows, on the x-axis, you've got the frequency of social learning in the population. So he assumed there's this population composed of individuals who are either pure asocial learners, so they never copy anyone else, they just do things for themselves, or they're pure social learners, so they never do anything for themselves and they just copy what other people around them are doing. And depending on what proportion of the population are these pure social learners, then it affects the fitness of the social learners. So the individual learners, who basically do everything for themselves, their fitness is flat, irrespective of the frequency of social learning in the population. But the social learners, as they get more popular, then the risks of them basically copying each other, which creates this kind of long chain of information transmission with ultimately very high probabilities that the information you're learning is out of date, the risk of that happening increases. And so the population tends to this equilibrium where the benefits you get from social learning, which is that you just get cheap information handed to you pretty easily, are offset by the fact that a lot of the time you're acquiring information that's past its sell-by date and it's somewhat useless. And so you reach this point where the population's at equilibrium and the social learners actually have no fitness advantage over the individual learners. So, although environmental change then can pose a problem for social learning, there's some experimental evidence that suggests that people at least take this into account in their behavior. So, this is a task that was given to participants. I think this is data collected by Ulf Tolsch. And participants basically had to solve this fiendishly complicated maze. And they started here, and basically they had to find a food item that was hidden in one of the four corners. And in this kind of simulated environment, there was a limited form of instability, which was basically that the food item could move between the corners periodically. Anyway, when the food item appeared to be pretty stable in terms of its location, people relied on the information offered by their kind of group mates to a reasonably large extent. But as they received cues that suggested the food moved around more, they decreased their reliance on that, on the socially acquired information, and they started doing things for themselves more. So they would explore this grid. And in another experiment conducted by the same team, and I won't go into the details of this one, but basically people were playing these sorts of, they were playing a task in a group where they repeatedly were required to make a decision. And again, in this context, the environment could change. And they found evidence that participants were basically monitoring the popularity of different options in the population. And when they sensed there was this kind of up-and-coming option that maybe was the new big thing, they would switch early. So even when it was still a minority position, participants could pick out these up-and-coming traits as basically signals that the environment had changed. So this is suggesting that although environmental change might be bad for naive social learning, maybe human social learning has features that allow it to kind of accommodate the fact that the environment might periodically change. That said, there are other forms of kind of more complex social learning that are known to be particularly bad. So one is conformist social learning. So in conformist social learning, you seek out popular traits that are already, in the majority of the population. And one of the interesting things is that conformist social learning is, in many circumstances, a highly adaptive strategy. So lots of theory shows that in most of the conditions where social learning is favored, conformist social learning is also favored. However, it's terrible, basically, at dealing with environmental change, because any new innovations always have to start in the minority. And conformist transmission really dislikes minority beliefs or opinions. So what happens is when the environment changes, yes, new information might be introduced by a minority of innovators, but those innovations are ignored by the majority of the population because they're conformists. And so in this graph, which is from a theoretical project done by Pete Richardson, this is time along the x-axis, and this is the invasion of a conformist genotype into a population of learners. And what happens is it starts off at around 50%, and then over time, because it's successful, it steadily invades, and then eventually it reaches fixation. If we look at population size at the same time, though, we can see that whilst this invasion is ongoing, the population manages to basically stay at capacity. It's doing reasonably well, even with the majority of the population being conformists. The minority of innovators are able to kind of track what in this case is a continuously varying environmental variable. However, once fixation is reached, that ability to track it is lost entirely, and the population size basically collapses, stages a brief resurgence, and then goes extinct. So this is an example of how conformist social learning can be catastrophically bad in an unstable environment. When we look at data concerning human behavior, so this is some work I did during my PhD, interestingly we find evidence that humans do engage in conformist transmission. So to the extent that humans are influenced by the level of consensus in the group, we seem to be attracted to majority positions, which, from given theoretical work, makes a lot of sense because this is a broadly adaptive learning rule. And so the hallmark of conformist transmission is a sort of a broadly S-shaped curve. So this is what proportion of the population say you should do X, and this is the probability that you do that, but it's on the log odds scale. So you can see it's initially low, but once you get to 50-50, it suddenly jumps up and then it kind of tapers off again. And when that graph is transformed into probabilities, it becomes even more S-shaped. So humans at least to some extent, engage in conformist transmission. But this is one of those strategies that we know, or at least theory suggests, is particularly bad in an unstable environment. And one of the sort of interesting things is that, well, humans evolved in an unusually unstable environment. So this is climactic variation over the past 6 million years. We can see the sort of the classic pattern of cooling. But associated with this cooling is an increase in the size of these oscillations in temperature, and it settles into cycles of different periods. So here at the end, it's settling into a 100,000 year cycle, but there's also evidence of quite large climactic variations on millennial and submillennial scales. And a bunch of ice cores are being processed at the moment that are going to try and increase the resolution of this even further. So it looks like a lot of our ancestors over the past couple of million years were living in like quite remarkably unstable environments, at least compared to what came before them. And so this then presents a bit of a conundrum. So to summarize, we've got theory that shows that social learning can be very bad in a changing environment, and the ancestral human environment was remarkably unstable. Experiments show that human social learning exhibits many features predicted by theory to be bad in a changing environment, but there's hints in the data of possible adaptive strategies too. So this leads to my, I guess, the question that's motivating this talk, which is how robust is human social learning to environmental change? And I'm going to address that with what at least I think is a reasonably novel method. So the work that I've gone over in the summary so far has basically been of two kinds. On the one hand, there's been experimental work where you get people represented by these little faces, and maybe you just study them individually, or you might arrange them into networks and see what happens. And on the other hand, there's been theoretical work, so where you get large populations of these simulated individuals represented by the little robot faces, and they reproduce, some of them die, they transmit genes or cultural information between themselves, and the population evolves over time. And so what I've been trying to do is bridge the gap between these two, smush them together into what I've been calling experimental evolutionary simulations. And so in many ways, these are pretty much identical to the theoretical simulations, except in place of the simulated agents, we put human participants. So we do this with a piece of software called Dillinger. It's freely available online if you guys want to use it. It's basically an automated experiment system, but we built it specifically to handle these sort of large-scale evolutionary experiments. So you give it an experimental design, and it will recruit, brief, and pay participants. It will put participants into some sort of simulated world and manage their communication, basically who can talk to who at what times, that sort of thing. It saves all the data, and it tidies up after itself. So it's, all in all, it basically makes experiments of a scale that were previously extremely difficult to do, it makes them more routine. I'll skim through this quickly, but basically Dillinger, to the extent that it hybridizes experiments and theory, on the one hand it kind of combines their strengths, but on the other it also kind of combines their weaknesses. So in terms of the cost, how expensive these experiments are to run, well, they kind of fall in between traditional experiments that are can be very expensive, or theory that is cheap, so they have a moderate cost. They're fast-ish. They're not as fast to run as theoretical simulations usually are, but they're certainly way faster than traditional experiments. You can run an experiment with a few thousand participants on Dillinger in maybe 2 days, something like that. They scale okay, not as well as theory. You're not going to be running experiments with millions of participants, but you can definitely run them with a few thousand. You get rich-ish evolutionary dynamics out of them because, to an extent you're constrained by the population size. There's only so many people for so many generations that you can observe. And like experiment, you get human brains in them, but I've called them human-ish brains because to interact with the Dillinger system, they're doing whatever they're doing on a computer, basically. We recruit these people over the internet, and this is all managed online. So you can't get like kind of the full spectrum of human behavior that you would maybe get in sort of real-world ethnographic studies. But at least there is a human sitting behind the keyboard doing stuff. So I'll present some results from a couple of experiments that we did with this. So the first experiment was more or less a proof of concept, saying like, do these experimental evolutionary simulations even generate the sort of reliable evolutionary dynamics? Do they make sense? And so what we sought to do was to try and reproduce the findings that I discussed in the introduction, produced by Alan Rogers, where you've got this mixed population of social learners and asocial learners, and you let them evolve. And the social learners do well because social learning is cheap, but they get punished by environmental change. So we recruited 1,600 participants in groups of 40, and then we arranged them into this kind of structure. So this is a sort of a sequential generational simulation. So each generation is 40 individuals. They all come and take part. Once they finish, another batch of 40 participants is recruited, and then we have genetic inheritance flowing down the generations. And there's cultural inheritance as well. And this repeats 40 times, so there's 40 generations. Yeah?
When you say genetic inheritance and cultural inheritance, how is that instantiated, or are you going to tell us?
Yeah, I'll come to that in just a few slides. Part of the problem with these experiments is trying to figure out a good way to explain what we did, because they become like really unwieldy quite fast. But yes, I'll come to that in a few slides. If it's still not clear by the time I get to the results, just put your hand up again and I'll try and do better. Okay, so these participants live in a world. It's a pretty strange world because all it contains, aside from them, is 80 blue or yellow dots. And the job of the participants is to identify the majority color of the dots. And environmental change is manifest as these dots reverse their colors every 10 generations. So right now, I don't want to embarrass myself by hazarding a guess, but let's say it's majority yellow. In 10 generations' time, it's going to be majority blue. So each participant took part in 125 repeat simulations. So of those 125, 5 were extremely easy, and they were just for practice. So when the participants first arrived, they solved 5 of those problems, very easy, gentle ones. This is just to get them up to speed. A further 12 were very easy, and these were sprinkled throughout the other trials just to make sure they were still paying attention. So any participant who didn't get, I think they had to get 11 or 12 of those trials right. If they got 10 or fewer correct, then we assumed they weren't paying attention because these trials are really easy, and we kicked them out, wiped all their data, recruited someone else to come and take over from them. The remaining, I think, 108 simulations were split into 3 difficulty conditions. So in the easy conditions, 52 of the dots were in the majority, so 52 of the 80 were, say, yellow, and the others were blue. This, to a human observer, is pretty obvious which one's in the majority. Then there was a moderate case and a hard case where the majority was just 42 out of the 80, and that's extremely difficult to see what's going on. Participants completed a single trial in each of those 125 simulations, and depending whether they were a social or an asocial learner, they received either asocial or social information. So this is what asocial information looks like. They get a look of the world, and they got to see it for a few seconds, I think maybe just 1 second, and then it goes away again. And this is what the social information looks like in this experiment. So this is cultural inheritance here. So someone is picked, this is matching the theoretical work of Alan Rogers. Someone is picked from the previous generation at random, and they are told what they said. So that is, their decision is being inherited from from a participant in the previous generation to a participant in this generation. And which kind of information you get is determined by a simulated genome with a single locus. So when participants arrive, they're basically reproduced, or they're produced by simulated asexual reproduction from the previous generation, and they inherit the genome of their parent, and it's subject to mutation. So the decisions participants make affect their fitness. And so their fitness, if they're asocial and right, they get a score of 1. Asocial and wrong, they get a score of 0. It's the same if they're social learners, but they get this bonus of 0.3, which reflects the fact that the social learning is cheaper than asocial learning. And then we squared the fitness function, and that was just to increase the likelihood that we'll get reliable evolutionary dynamics over the small experimental timescales that these experiments are looking at. So we've got a population of 40 people for 40 generations. Squaring the fitness function basically just increases the strength of selection, so that evolutionary dynamics are more reliable. This is, I will say, like extremely strong selection. Even for agent-based models typically have very strong selection in them compared to the real world. This is strong even compared to that. So it's one of the trade-offs of this approach. And so once fitness was calculated, participants reproduced to create the next generation. And then this process just repeats. Okay, Any questions at this point? Does this make sense? Yeah.
The information that was provided to the social participants,
Mhm.
they had to follow that, or they were just given that?
They were just given that, and they could do whatever they wanted with it, and we'll come to that a lot in the results. Okay, so the predictions that we went into this experiment with were, well, one, social learning will invade because it's cheap, but the social learners, by design, have no defense against environmental change, right? They're like, what strategy could they possibly do, given that they're just told what one person said, to try and mitigate the effects of environmental change? And so because of that, we predicted that environmental change will negatively affect social learning, and we weren't too sure what the effect of the different difficulty conditions will be. Okay, so let's look at some results. So first I'll show the evolutionary dynamics of this gene for social learning. This is what theory predicts will be the case when the asocial learners are extremely good at the task. So this is basically the easy condition. So the social learning allele invades, but whenever the environment changes, which is these blocks of 10 generations, the social learning allele falls down before recovering, falls down, recovers, falls down, recovers, and this just cycles indefinitely. So I'll now add on the experimental evolutionary dynamics. So in the easy condition, we get this. So it's broadly similar in that we get the invasion followed by drops and then this cycles, but the drop is far smaller than theory predicts. And if we add the other conditions, then that pattern basically continues. So as you increase the difficulty, the overall frequency of social learning goes up and the drop gets smaller. And in fact, in the hard condition, the drop is barely visible. Statistically, you can detect it. It's something like a 2% drop on average, but it's basically minuscule. So, yeah.
Sorry, I'm the slow one here. What exactly is the y-axis measuring?
So this is what proportion of the population are social learners.
And by social learners, does that mean
Their participants
coordination of their answer with the answer they got from the social learner?
It means, if I go back a couple of slides, it means that they are being presented this information as opposed to that information. So this, which kind of information they get is determined by their genome, which is allowed to evolve over time. We start the population just with asocial learners. This kind of learner does invade, but whenever the environment changes, they suffer, basically, because they're adopting old information.
Thanks.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. So there's a couple of things to explain. The first one, which is easier, is why is social learning more frequent when the task is harder? And the task was indeed much harder. So in the easy condition, the asocial learners are performing at ceiling. So this is the condition on the x-axis and their accuracy at the task on the y-axis. At easy, they're at ceiling, moderate in between, and hard, they're performing above chance, but not amazingly above chance. And so the harder conditions were basically suppressing asocial learning, because the asocial learners have to pay a cost to access that information. It's baked into the experiment. But because when the task gets hard, they get almost no payoff from that information because it's such poor quality information, basically. And so that allows the social learning allele to spread to higher levels just because it's cheaper, even if you're not getting any better information via social learning. But the more interesting thing, I think, is, well, why is the drop weirdly small? Why is it here? It decreases by maybe 15%, whereas in theory it should decrease from about 75 to 25, so almost a 50% drop. And the answer is that many of the social learners were contrary. So when they're told that the person, someone in the previous generation decided blue, they would choose yellow. And so net contrariness was actually pretty high. It was 14% of trials. People did the opposite of what their demonstrator told them. But this was basically driven by a minority of participants who are highly contrary. So this is how contrary you are from never to always. And if you look at the histogram, that's just a histogram of each individual participant. So if you take the average contrariness of each participant, this is what it looks like. So the majority of participants were never contrary. They just always did what they were told. But a minority were much more contrary. And actually there is one participant all the way at the end who I think they received social information on 68 trials, and every single time they did the opposite of what they were told. So, one possibility, and this was my first reaction, I guess, is that this is just participants who just don't care about the experiment, right? I mean, we pay them a little bit for it, but it's not a huge amount of money, so they're just bashing their way through. But I think there's some reasons to suspect that that isn't the case. The first is that there's no meaningful correlation between contrariness and asocial performance. So if participants were just mashing mindlessly, you'd expect them to be contrary some of the time because they're just mashing, but also they shouldn't be particularly good at the asocial task. And actually, if you compare the participants who are more contrary and say, well, do they have a similarly decreased asocial performance on the trials where they saw the dots themselves? The answer is no. There is a statistically significant correlation, but contrariness explains about 1% of the variation in asocial performance. So it's not telling you a great deal about what's going on. The other thing is that all the contrary participants passed the attention check, because any participants who didn't were just excluded from the data set and someone else was introduced. And the final thing is that a real minority of participants were contrary way beyond chance levels. So that's if they were just mashing at random, you'd expect them to be contrary about 50% of the time, but some of them were contrary like way beyond that amount. So this suggests that to at least an extent, contrariness was a deliberate strategy by these participants. They're like, why exactly that was is kind of hard to answer, and that's something I'll come back to later. But anyway, so if we introduce contrariness into the theoretical simulations, we can actually bring the theoretical results right back in line with the experimental ones. So this is theory when contrariness is 0, and this is just zooming in on one of the drops and then the recoveries over just 10 generations. When we increase contrariness, so here's like an intermediate level of 4% contrariness, but when we set it to 14%, which is roughly the level of contrariness we observed across all participants, then you get dynamics that are extremely similar to the experimental dynamics that we observed. And so we can see that this contrariness basically acts to buffer the population as a whole. Chances are it's introducing bad information. Like if someone sees the dots and they say there's more blue, someone copies them, but actually decides to be contrarian and says, no, there's more yellow. Chances are that the original person was right, and so by being contrary, you're getting it wrong. But by circulating a certain amount of inaccurate information in the population, it increases cultural diversity. And so when the environment does change, some of that incorrect information is now correct. And so the population can recover more quickly. So this, the x-axis is time again, and the y-axis is what proportion of the population are getting it right now. And it's a complicated graph. But so the kind of faded straight dashed lines that's asocial performance, so how good the asocial learners are. And what you can see is that the solid lines are the populations in the easy, moderate, and hard condition. They all initially decrease a little bit, and this is as the social learners invade and start being contrary, they start kind of corrupting the signal in the population, so performance goes down. And then when the environment changes, you do get a drop and it bounces back. But if we compare it, say, with this black dotted line, which is what theory predicts would happen if there was very little contrariness, there the drop is huge. So these populations basically go through a short period of time where the average information in the population is bad. Whereas in these cases, you have to put up with the fact that the information in the population is never brilliant, but then it buffers you when you go through the environmental changes. It kind of smooths it over a little bit. And if we zoom in on one of these recoveries, this basically shows the same thing in more detail. When there's less contrariness in theory, you start off way lower because the drop's more severe, but you end up much higher afterwards. In the data where people were more contrary, the drop is less severe, but you don't get as high as you would afterwards. Okay, so some like mini conclusions from the first experiment. So social learning did invade because it is cheap, and environmental change did negatively affect social learning. But it turns out, sort of against our expectations, the social learners, in a sense, were not totally defenseless. Contrariness basically risks your personal payoffs, because in general it is a bad idea if you're a selfish individual, but it does kind of perversely have this like property of being beneficial to the group by circulating information that might be useful later. And we found that harder tasks should be social. Harder tasks favor social learning. Okay, but so what about richer social information? So remember these figures where the conformists invade the population, take over, and then everyone dies? This is a form of social learning that was not possible in our experiments. This is conformist transmission. You need to basically canvass the opinions of many individuals, and so you can get a sense of the level of consensus in the population, and you use that to guide your decisions. And what about even richer social information? So here in this experiment where participants were spotting up-and-coming traits, you need that information, but you need it then broken down by time. So you can see how the popularity of different ideas is steadily changing over time periods, so you can spot the one that's kind of trending upwards. So what we did, we returned to the experiment and we changed the design to allow these more complicated forms of social information use. So we basically repeated the experiment with the following differences. One is that participants now know that the environment changes. They just don't know when it changes. So in the previous experiment, participants had basically very little knowledge of what the experiment they were doing was even about. We staggered the environmental change. This was just to throw participants off a little bit. So in different simulations, it didn't always change on generations 10, 20, and 30. In some of them, it was 15, 25, 35, or 11, 21, 31, that sort of thing. And we set all simulations to the easy difficulty, so the asocial task was super easy. And instead, we had 3 conditions that affected what kind of social information the social learners got, which was poor, moderate, or rich. So poor was the same as in the first experiment, so they just heard from one individual. Moderate was that they got to see the decisions of everyone in the previous generation. So this was 40 individuals, and that would look like this. So in the previous batch, 30 people decided blue and 10 people decided yellow. So this allows participants to engage in sort of conformist transmission or anti-conformist transmission, or other kind of weird learning rules that somehow respond to the level of consensus in the population. And in the rich condition, they got the same thing, but they got it for 3 generations going back in time. So they were told that in the previous batch it was this, in the batch before that it was this, and in the batch before that it was this. So in that case, they get to hear from 120 different individuals. Okay. So what did these results look like? So this is again what theory predicts with the poor social information, and this is what we found this time. And if I just flag this next to the results from the first experiment, you'll see that actually it looks kind of different. So in theory, the poor information condition, so that's this one here from experiment 2, should exactly match the easy condition in experiment 1, but they're super different. Why is this? What I think is going on is it's now they know the environment changes, and their contrariness goes way up. So when they didn't know the environment was changing, they were contrary about 14% of the time. When they did know that the environment could change, their contrariness went up to about 33%. So a third of the time they're doing the opposite of what they're suggested to do. Yeah?
With the staggered environmental change, have you adjusted it so that
Yes.
it's always 0 and 10?
Yes. So these are like lined up so the environmental change always falls on top of each other. Yes. Yeah, so we get this enhanced contrariness. Okay, but so what about the effects of the moderate social information? And so if they were basically pure conformists, just always going for what the majority option is, this is what theory suggests should happen. It's basically the same as with the poor social information, but kind of on steroids. You get a really fast increase in social learning because conformist transmission is a good idea. It helps you see the signal in the population, but then you get kind of catastrophic decreases in the social learning allele following environmental change. That was the results with the poor social information, and now I'll add on with the moderate social information, so when participants got to see what everyone did in the previous generation. This is the yellow line here, and it's a pretty good fit for theory. You get the fast increase, sudden decrease, but again, it's compressed. So the drop is not as severe as we might expect. So how were participants using this information? Well, if you plot the probability that, say, they chose blue, depending on what proportion of their demonstrators said they should choose blue, you get something that looks a lot like conformist transmission. So this is the data binned by every possible proportion of demonstrators out of the 40 that could have said blue, and then it's just a simple binomial confidence interval. This one's really big because it turns out across the hundreds of thousands of trials, by chance, it almost never happened that exactly 0.2 of the demonstrators said blue. But this is, it's an extreme S-curve. This is probably one of the most discrete S-curves that has been documented experimentally. So people are doing something very conformist-like. But again, we see a lot of contrariness. So this is a figure with 1,600 lines on it. So imagine that. But so this, for every participant, so we've got 1,600 participants, I asked the analysis to fit a separate curve for each of those participants. So this is the same figure, but basically broken down by every participant. And I color-coded it to try and make it a bit easier to follow. So these red participants, and these are the overwhelming majority, are extremely conformist. Then there's a chunk in green who are definitely conformist, but there's this kind of compression effect. So they have like a moderate amount of contrariness. There's participants in blue, there's actually no statistical evidence that they're doing anything other than behaving at random. So they just seem to be ignoring the social information or being sufficiently contrary that there's no net influence. And then in black we have a minority of participants who are like aggressively contrarian. So these ones up here, these participants basically do the opposite of what the social information says. So if 25 say yellow and 15 say blue, they go blue, and they do so very reliably. So the net effect, so this plot has the data on it. This solid line is kind of the modal participant or the typical participant response, but the population average gets skewed down by that minority that are contrary, and that produces this dashed line, which actually fits the data as we would expect very closely. So this explains, I think again, so it's the contrariness that is causing the contraction of the dynamics in the experiment relative to that predicted by theory. So what happened with the rich social information? So this was the same information but across 3 generations. I guess spoiler, I'm not entirely sure what participants are doing with this information. It's incredibly rich and complicated information. There's an infinite number of things they could be doing with it, so I'm not entirely confident exactly what they are doing. But so one possibility is that they're just aggregating the 3 generations into one sort of cohort, and then they're behaving in a conformist fashion according to that. So they say, they've got 3 groups of 40, they combine them into a single group of 120, and then they respond to the popularity of blue within that group of 120. I'm pretty confident they're not doing that, because when you try and plot that figure, instead of getting the nice S-curve, you get something that's vaguely S-shaped, but especially in the middle, it's a big smush. So they're not simply just aggregating stuff. Another possibility is that given that they know the environment changes, maybe they're just ignoring the information from 2 and 3 generations ago and just attending to the most up-to-date information. But again, if we try and plot this figure for just the most up-to-date information, they're not doing that either. It's a bit of a smush as opposed to this really sort of extreme S-curve. So whatever they're doing, and I'm still trying to dig in to figure out what they are doing, they're somehow combining the information from the 3 generations, but not just in an additive way. So it's possible that they are doing something like this hypothesized learning rule, where they're actually monitoring differences between the generations, looking for whichever one is trending upwards and trying to adopt that one. And actually, so we gave participants 3 response boxes at the end to tell us what they were doing, and a handful, maybe less than 10 out of 1,600, said that's exactly what they were doing. But most other participants came up with varying peculiar theories. But anyway, so if they potentially are doing this adaptive strategy, does this help the population? does it help solve the problem that environmental change poses to social learning? So the y-axis here is what proportion of the population are getting it right over time. And so this is the time on the x-axis. And so conformist theory basically says that everyone should do brilliantly, the environment changes, everyone does terribly, a social learning has to come in to fix the problem, you get this massive fall off in the proportion of the population that are engaging in social learning. Once the asocial learners get the right answer back to majority status again, social learning takes over and locks it up to the top. So this is what theory, like a sort of a pure conformist theory, suggests should be happening. With our poor social information, we get something like this. So there's a lot of contrariness, it depresses things, and you get these kind of little drops following environmental change. With the moderate social information, so where participants can see one generation and they are basically engaging in conformist transmission, but with some kind of maverick contrarians to mix things up a bit, you get something that looks a lot like the theoretical predictions, but again, it's just slightly compressed. The peaks aren't quite as high and the troughs aren't quite as deep. So now we come to the rich social information, which has the potential to like solve this problem in a nice and kind of heroic fashion. Are people doing the right thing? The answer is no. The dynamics are basically the same as with the moderate social information. The peaks are just as high, the troughs are just as deep. And actually, if we go rather from this is the dynamics of the kind of the culture of the population, like how accurate is the culture. If we go look at the genetic dynamics, so this is the frequency of the social learning allele. So the yellow line is the moderate social information condition. If we now add the results from the rich social information condition, it actually, in terms of the genetic dynamics, makes things worse. So the drop is the same size, but the recovery takes about one generation longer. And so what's happening here is that basically by giving participants access to multi-generational information, we've created a cultural lag. So participants are in this situation where, let's say, the information in the most recent generation is kind of ambiguous. Some people are saying blue, some people are saying yellow, but maybe in their great-grandparents' generation, everyone thought it was blue. So rather than saying, oh, it looks like yellow is becoming more popular, maybe that's what I should do, participants are instead saying, well, my parents' generation didn't really know what was going on, but my great-grandparents were sure it was blue, so I'm going to go for blue. And so in order to allow the population to adapt, selection basically has to step in and suppress the proportion of the population that are social learners for longer. They need to keep the social learners out of the way until that the knowledge of what was going on in the past is safely forgotten, and then the social learning gene can invade and it stabilizes the new information that's been produced by asocial learners during this kind of collapse of the social learning allele. Yeah.
Were participants being more contrarian in the first 10 generations? Is that why it kind of takes a few?
Oh, so I haven't actually checked that, but I don't think so, because participants had no idea what generation they were in. What's going on is that, so for the first 3 generations, this is fixed to 0, because in the rich social information condition, you need to have 3 generations of ancestors before it can work. And then the other thing is that these are the multiple repeat simulations lined up, so the environmental change coincides. And so actually here, a bunch of the simulations haven't even started. Some of them start there. And then similarly, at the far end, some of them actually stop here, which is why some of these lines get a bit kind of loose towards the end, because there's less data on the fringes of the plots. Yeah. Okay, so conclusions. Despite the risks and despite knowing that the environment could change, participants nonetheless engage in conformist transmission, but a minority of contrarians in the population at least help a bit. How exactly participants are responding to multi-generational information is unclear, but it's not, they're not doing a brilliant job of identifying up-and-coming traits, and instead it seems to be creating a cultural inertia that harms social learning following environmental change. A couple of further questions. A big one that I think is important to this is just how real is this contrariness? If we gave people like actually important real life decisions, would all this contrariness go away? A ton of experiments have reported contrariness in experiments like these, and I think there are good reasons to think that it at least has something to do with the low stakes that are at hand. But on the flip side, we did these experiments on MTurk, and Turkers generally take their stuff like way more seriously than undergrads do in the lab, for instance. They're doing it for money, and they want money, and we paid them according to how many questions they got right, so they were motivated to get them right. And because many of them work for sort of corporate clients, they're very afraid that if they do a bad job, we're going to report them to Amazon and they'll get their accounts suspended. Which obviously we never do, but I guess some of the corporate people who put jobs on MTurk do that. So this makes me think that I suspect that at least some of this contrariness is real. I mean, in the real world, we all know people who just are like obstinate contrarians, basically. Another thing is that in these experiments, adaptation is mostly genetic. Basically, because participants' social learning behaviors were bad at dealing with environmental change, the way that adaptation happened was that selection stepped in, basically killed all the social learners, allowed asocial learners to spread instead. They solved the problem, and then the social learners reinvaded. That's only possible in these experiments because we've got aggressive selection acting on genes. Obviously, in the real world, this process would take way longer. So I think an open question is, what would happen if, say, we reran these experiments without any genes in it at all? Participants just have free access to social and asocial information. What kind of evolutionary dynamics do we observe then? We did do a follow-up experiment that I cut because I wanted to dive deeper into this stuff, where we gave the social learners, they got social information, and then they could pay to also see the dots for themselves as well, if they wanted to. And it didn't really change anything. Participants do pay to see the dots quite a lot, but they don't really seem to do so in an effective way, and not in a way that changes the evolutionary dynamics of the experimental simulation. Okay, so overall conclusions. So experimental evolutionary simulations fall between traditional theory and experiment. They allow us to investigate the evolutionary dynamics resulting from human psychology at modest scales. And in this case, we use them to find that humans are not very adept at using consensus to navigate a changing environment, but that contrariness helps. Thank you. Yeah.
I have several questions. This is really interesting stuff. But I'll start with one. So, in terms of I realized that you did the simulations to try to specifically look at the Alan Rogers model. But making it more realistic obviously there's a bunch of things you can do to make it more realistic, right? But one of them that jumps immediately to mind is that in social learning situations in the real world, part of the reason that social learning presumably is useful is that you're not guessing at a coin toss, right? You're not guessing at a binary thing. So if you think about foraging knowledge, it's not just do I go left or right, it's like, do I go to this specific place that everybody knows is good? So I guess my question is, what would happen, what do you think would happen, and maybe there's theory on this that I'm not aware of, if you expand the number of options for the environmental state to be nearly infinite?
Yeah. That's a good question. So yes, you're totally right that this task we gave them is super artificial, super weird. It's far simpler than almost anything humans ever do in their lifetime. I do think it would be worth expanding these sorts of paradigms to include more complex tasks. I'm currently working with a postdoc, Elena Mew, to try and introduce a much more complicated task, but one that also has a cumulative aspect to it. So participants aren't just solving a single problem; they're coming up with solutions and then refining them over time. So we'll see what happens there. One of the trade-offs is, though, that because those tasks require more and more time, it actually makes it harder to run these large-scale experiments potentially. But, I mean, I guess specifically in your question you asked what would happen if we increased the number of options that they were choosing between. I guess the answer is I don't know, but there is data out there. So I did some experiments with Joe Henrich and Mike Muthukrishna where we looked at how people responded to consensus when there were more options to choose between. And I'm pretty sure that the greater the number of options, the more conformist participants were. So when there was only 2, they weren't particularly conformist. There was a lot more contrariness. But as the options went up, they basically just started, whichever one was the most popular, they're just like, okay, I'll just go for that one. So you're right, actually, that would be really interesting to see that does just increasing it to like there are 5 options to choose between, is that enough to like really reduce the contrariness? Because I guess, throughout this talk, I've kind of been hinting at this idea that contrariness is in some senses adaptive for the group. I mean, it's not good to be the contrarian yourself because you're making bad decisions. But if you're in a group with, a bunch of contrarians over there, it's really good for you if you're not a contrarian because you get later to take advantage of any like information that they happen to produce. So yeah, it'd be good to see if increasing the number of options decreases contrariness. Oh, Brooke?
So, if instead of having the richness of the information be based on conformity, you instead made it based on prestige bias kind of ideas, right? Where you gave them information about this person, you're getting information from this person who's accurate 90% of the time versus 70% of the time or something like that. How do you expect?
Yeah, so this is something we thought about when we were designing these experiments. In general, I think that information will make a big difference. I think it's way more useful than information about the level of consensus in the population. I think if you've got access to high quality information about payoffs, you should probably just ignore consensus. The reason that we didn't include payoff-based information in these experiments and stuck with consensus is that it's not obvious to me how available information about payoffs is in the real world. Information about the level of consensus is reasonably easy to get hold of, but information about like how the effect that someone's decision that they've made, how that affects their fitness can often be really opaque. Might take years for the full effects to be apparent. And even once like you can see that someone's been super successful, it's like, well, which bit of what they're doing is responsible for that? So there's a lot of I sort of see payoff information is kind of like this holy grail for the social learners, right? If you get good quality payoff information, that's it. You just know what the right answer is. And so I think, yeah, there's this big problem about though, like how available is it to people most of the time. There's also the fact that because in this experiment, it's a simple binary task, a lot of that real world complexity is gone, right? So if I said to you that, this person said blue and they're right, then it's, there's no question anymore. I guess we could have maybe given people a bunch of difficult asocial trials early on and then scored them by their average accuracy. So you can say to this, this person says it's blue and they're in the top 10% of all participants for accuracy, something like that. That would maybe be this more kind of indirect cue. So yeah, I think that would be great. I think it would be sensible to include that in further experiments. Yeah.
So with empirical participants, it seems like there are maybe two ways they could defect. So one is to just click randomly, right? Just want to get done with it, get paid, whatever. Another way for a participant may defect is to say, well, I think the experimenter wants me to do A, and I'm going to do B. Of course, if the participant wants to cooperate and they think that you to pick, they think that the experimenter wants you to pick A and they pick A because of that, that's just not good for the experiment. Yeah. But they're trying to cooperate. But yeah, so on the other end, you have these defectors who might be saying, I'm just going to be contrarian to try and screw up what I think this experiment is about. And so, the kind of the ways you look at contrarianness in the participants address the first option I mentioned, where they're just clicking through randomly to get done with the experiment. But it might be that they're just kind of being spiteful and just picking what the opposite answer is just because it's cheap and because it don't like researchers or?
Yeah. That's definitely a possibility, especially for the hyper-contrarians who never do what the social information suggests they do. It could be because, they're looking to like muck up the experiment. When I've done these experiments with undergrads, a lot of them, because they've got psych backgrounds, they know about social psychology and how experimenters are always lying to them and how everyone's a confederate. So, in their like feedback forms, they're like, I knew you guys were trying to trick me, so I just did whatever you told me not to do. Yay, I win. And obviously, we're not lying to them, but they think we are. So there are like a variety of reasons why they might be doing this. In my experience, which I guess is anecdotal, but I find Turkers are less spiteful than university participants because, like I said, they're in it for the money, and so they're often quite serious about trying to maximize their payoffs per minute, and they've got this whole infrastructure, kind of like Yelp, but for MTurk, where they review people like me who put experiments up, so they know not to go to someone whose experiments take 20 minutes, crash repeatedly, and then you get like 5 cents for taking part, that sort of thing. And in general, I'm more wary of them doing things in order to try and please the experimenter because they're afraid that we're going to review them negatively, because I think Amazon has like a 3 strikes and you're out policy. So whenever they submit work, whenever they complete an experiment, we're allowed to reject what they've done, and if they get rejected 3 times, then they lose their account. We never reject anyone. Like the people who didn't pay attention, we just accepted their data, deleted it, and recruited someone else. But participants, they're pretty afraid of stuff like that. They definitely will, if there's a way to mash through an experiment really quickly, and that brings greater utility than going slow but thinking about what you're doing, they will definitely mash through as fast as they can. So often we put like time gates in stuff, so you have to look at the stimuli for like 20 seconds before you're allowed to make a response, and at that point the utility in mashing is really low because you're forced to spend time on looking at the stimuli anyway. But you're right, these are all worries about the participant pool that we're recruiting from. Yeah.
So I have a more conceptual question about the relationship between the theory and the experiments. Super interesting to use this hybrid of humans where you're sort of using their brains as part of the evolutionary dynamics, but then you also offload some of the evolutionary dynamics onto some sort of an algorithm, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's interesting to think through like what role is the human psychology playing. So I'm wondering, because in psychology we make this distinction between perception and judgment. So there's 2 layers, right? There's what you actually, the knowledge that comes in, and then there's how you act on it. And it strikes me that, so I think in the Rogers original models, those are mashed into the same thing, right? Where there's just a strategy that combines both perception and decision, right? But in your simulations, if I'm not mistaken, the genetic inheritance is essentially of the perception system, right? But the judgment rule is done by the human psychology, right? And you have no real influence over that, right?
No.
And that's why you get the contrarians, right? Because they're actually not doing what the decision rule is supposed to do, which is follow the majority.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't have any specific question. I'm just interested in your thoughts about. I mean, in one way, that means that your simulation is not a precise conceptual replication of Rogers, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you see that in the dynamics, right? They're not what you predict, right? But I'm just wondering. Your thoughts on that, because I could see it doing it different ways, where you vary both the information that you give people, but then also, I guess it wouldn't really be interesting to force them into a particular decision.
Yeah. So we've done other experiments where the genes have other influences on the participants. So in this case, you're right, it's perceptual. We're basically masking or revealing different kinds of information to them. We did some other experiments looking at the Baldwin effect, where the genes force participants' behavior down certain pathways. So this is exploring the fact that can genetic evolution, will the Baldwin effect happen with human participants on MTurk in one of our experiments? And it does. Where participants tend to get things wrong, selection favors genetic influence on those bits of the behavior to force participants to get it right, basically. So that's this genetic evolution taking over from developmental plasticity. There's another experiment. So in this case, I almost think of these kinds of experiments, it's almost a bit like doing simulated lesion studies. So we used experimental design to effectively cap how long participants could remember information for by having time limits, at which point we made sure that no previously collected information was relevant anymore. So this is basically a way to simulate participants having shorter memory spans. So it's a bit like, I don't know, if you got the transcranial magnetic stimulation and knocked out, working memory for a while. And in those experiments, we saw this kind of unmasking effect where we use simulated genes to mask both the ability to acquire information. Susan saw this a couple of weeks ago, I think. Yeah, this is the stuff I presented in Berkeley.
Yeah.
So we use genes to mask both the ability to acquire information and the ability to store them. And if you fix either one of them really low, then the other one doesn't unmask. But if you allow both of them to vary, then over time, genes are favored that allow them to basically co-evolve back up to, like, I don't know, the information collection and storage capacities of just actual participants without the genes getting in the way. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways. These participants, I think in an earlier version of some of the write-ups of this, we called them cyborgs, because they're like part participant, part machine. And there's a bunch of ways in which you can smush the two together. The tricky bit is figuring out how to do that smushing through an interface on a screen. But yeah, so you can present information, you can try and mask their cognitive abilities, you can force them to behave in certain ways. There's a bunch of things you can do. Yeah?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I guess I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, I guess, like what we do with these experiments when we map them back into environmental context of human behavior, because I assume that the benefit of using mTurk samples is that you can isolate things that in maybe the other kinds of conditions you can't isolate. And an example would be separating out, having only social information versus only observational information, whereas I would think in many real-life contexts you have some sort of hybrid of the two and you're favoring one versus the other, or using information that kind of combines the two. I don't know, and I guess I'm wondering, with these results, how do we, how does that inform this idea of like, now I have both streams of information available? Like, what did we learn from this that helps us understand that?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this does make sense. So out in the real world, you're definitely right that people do combine sources of both like social and asocial information into making their decisions. In these experiments, we're artificially forcing them to do one or the other, and this is in part a reflection of the theoretical literature that it builds on and all that sort of stuff. I guess also just the primary benefit of using mTurk is just sample size. There's no other service that can give you like 3,000 participants in 48 hours as easily. But the general sort of experimental psychological thing of getting people to play a game on a computer does allow you this kind of like extreme, like surgical level of precision in terms of like controlling what information they see and what they don't see. In the real world, where this stuff is all more free floating, rather than seeing people having pure strategies, I would expect to see mixed strategies. So, when say Roger's work says, we should converge on this like mixed equilibrium, in terms of the real world, what I take from that is not that we should expect to see a world where like 50% of people are pure asocial learners and fixed 50% are pure social learners, but that we should see people kind of weighting. They'll be using both kinds of information and weighting them in some way. And so when I see here that a bunch of people are total mavericks when they're given social information, I suspect in the real world probably just using other kinds of information. Like the contrarians, maybe they just underweight social information, and so when that's all that they're given, they kind of just do the opposite of what it says. But when they've got more, choice, then we can. I would expect them to go and maybe be gathering information themselves. So in the third experiment that I didn't present, where we gave social learners the option to choose to pay for the dots themselves, we didn't do this, but if we had, for instance, given them the social information, made them make a decision, and then said, do you want to pay to see the dots, and had them make another decision, I wonder if my prediction would be that the participants that are contrary would be more likely to seek out other kinds of information. Because, or at least that's based on the hypothesis that contrariness is an outcome of participants who don't value social information very highly, being forced to make decisions according to social information. Yeah, go for it.
Is it possible then that what we're interpreting from these experiments as contrariness is something that relates to what Brooke had said earlier, which is possibly just discounting information that comes from an unknown source or a stranger, where, I mean, in many real-life interactions, you would know the people who are giving you information, and you would be able to evaluate them based on many different criteria, not just their success rate in past endeavors, but also your relationship to the person, and then anything related to their own personality or any qualities about those people. And so is contrariness like a real construct that can be lifted out of the experiment, or could it be more a sort of reflection of discerning relationships or interpreting social information contingent on those relationships?
Yeah, so you, just to clarify, I guess, so you're suggesting that if we gave, in the real world, these participants who are contrary, if they were receiving advice from someone they knew and they could see that they're not a confederate in an experiment trying to trick them, and they know that they've been reasonably successful, maybe they trust them, maybe they're a family member, something like that, then the contrariness would potentially go away because they've got this, it's more like a verifiable source for the information. I think that's super plausible. The contrarian participants are a minority. It really might be that they're the minority of MTurk workers who have a degree in social psychology, and so they know about this stuff, and so their hackles are up or whatever. I think people generally approach social information with a certain amount of suspicion, because talk is cheap. We know gossip is often used for sort of self-serving reasons, that sort of thing. So you're totally right. I guess this is just underlies the fact that it's hard to interpret the contrariness in terms of participants' motivations for being contrary. And while it's been documented a ton of times now, kind of accidentally by experiments like this, where we have people in the lab and we give them social information and see what they do with it, it would be good to start nudging that into more complicated sort of real world-esque settings and see what happens to the contrariness. Because I might be contrary to some faceless experimenter online, but if my sister came and told me something, I would probably listen to what she has to say, at least more than I would the people on MTurk. Yeah.
A suggestion and a question. So a suggestion is following up kind of directly on that last conversation. The idea that in real-world decision-making, we're likely balancing some combination of social and asocial information. It sounds like the way you've modeled that in experiments is with the option to buy the asocial information, which kind of simulates a scenario. I've got some decision to make. I have social information. I can go out and pay some costs to find more information. Of course, sometimes when I have decisions, I already have that information. You might consider modeling that by giving people differential brief flashes of the image, and then you could kind of tease apart things that way. That's the suggestion. The question would be, how would you, I'm thinking about different domains of kind of decision making where you presented ancestral conditions that fluctuated wildly in terms of climate or something like that, which is presumably playing out over a period of decades or generations or longer. But then, shifting, and a lot of real world, like physical things about the world are probably going to be that way, whereas social conditions are also things that we're trying to map and change, and those can be changing much, much faster. And so just like open-ended, how do you think about taking this kind of information and then thinking about like very different rates of change or change in different kind of domains of decision making?
That's interesting. So in terms of like historical climactic changes, I think the rates of change observed in these or implemented in these experiments are fast even compared to those. I mean, it's kind of, our resolution is limited, but I mean, in general, I would say now we've got, good evidence for like millennial scale climactic change, or when our ancestors were hanging around. But here we've got the environment reversing every 10 generations. And so like, I don't know, if we take the gambit that this is somewhat realistic, let's say a generation's 25 years, 10 generations is like 250 years. So this is really fast, it's definitely submillennial. So it may be faster, it may be too fast for the sorts of climactic change that our ancestors were experiencing. If most changes were occurring on the order of like a few thousand years, then these problems are going to get easier for the populations to solve because they've got longer periods of stability. But you're right that cultural dynamics can be super fast, and in those cases in particular, there's often benefits, or at least I can see the case being made that there are enhanced benefits to being contrary because, sometimes maybe in like fashion or dialect and stuff like that, you're not necessarily like solving some adaptive problem in the environment, you're signaling something about yourself, in the same way that people like to be seen to be like trendy or cutting edge and stuff like that. So in terms of keeping up with cultural change, which I'm happy to say might be a bit faster than the sort of climactic change that has been going on in human history. These might be more representative of those sorts of problems, although in this case you've got these like super severe fitness effects, and like, I don't know, I feel that people who dress slightly differently to make a statement don't experience like fitness effects on that scale from the decisions that they're making. In regards to your suggestion at the start, so there's actually quite a lot of variation in how these experimental designs have been implemented. They're giving people social information and letting them pay for asocial. I don't know that has been implemented in other experiments. Most of the time, it's either pick one or the other. You're just given a choice and you choose, or you're given both in some order, and then statistically after the fact, we use analyses to tease apart the effects of the two. So there is a bunch of variation already in that regards, though I can't remember what your specific suggestion was, but I don't think I can remember thinking that specific suggestion had not been implemented. Yeah. Sure.
Really interesting work. It's great to see this stuff being developed in these new tools. It's amazing. I was wondering about the framing of the work in terms of a general trend towards cooling climates, but also increased variability, which is a classic way to frame, obviously Richardson's work on this topic. I'm wondering, of all of the potential shifts that have occurred in human evolution that people have drawn attention to, and certainly the backdrop of environmental change is one of the really interesting ways to think about how does culture get going. What does culture provide you with? I'm wondering if you could translate this theory, not just in terms of being able to adapt in a single locale to a changing environment, but also in terms of the demographic process of migration, for example, adapting to new parts of the globe, which is a real, if I think about what are some of the things that culture gives you, what are some of the things that big brains give you in general, it's this ability to adapt to novel environments, perhaps. We saw a talk about that pretty recently.
Yeah.
So do you think that these same ideas about adaptation on sort of a temporal scale to changing environments are analogous enough to adapting or through the process of migration, through the process of, the culturally, some of the fitness advantages of culture in those terms, in the spatial sense?
So I guess the short answer is yes, I think there's some mileage to be got out of this vein of thinking. On the one hand, you can kind of imagine the environmental change. I've described it as an environment flicking between two states, basically, but you could imagine it as a population wholesale, up and moving to a different environment, and now they're in a different place. It's kind of weird that these populations, if you migrated, you've migrated, so you need to adapt now to potentially different conditions, whereas in these experiments, they didn't get that signal. So I think if you wanted to do an experiment trying to tap into that thing, then you would need to tell people that the environment's changed now and see how they behave. Because this is a simple binary choice task, if you told them the environment's changed, I'm sure they're smart enough to know that okay, so I should just do the thing that I wasn't doing before, basically. But there's another kind of migration, and this one's been modeled a lot, which is the migration of individuals between existing populations. So the populations are reasonably stable, but there's flow of individuals between them. And in some ways, that's the kind of the reverse of the temporal change, because whereas a temporally varying environment kind of hammers conformist transmission, it's a bad idea. If you're a new migrant arriving in a new area and there's a resident population, conformist transmission is probably the best thing to do. And I think that's the context in which Pete and Rob first introduced it, basically talking about individuals arriving in probably an infinite population, because it would be an analytic model. So yeah, I think there's some analogs between temporal and spatial variation, but we just need to be careful. Thank you.